Book 10, Chapter 4 of the Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, translated by Constance Garnett. Book 10, Chapter 4, The Lost Dog. Kolya leant against the fence with an air of dignity, waiting for Alyosha to appear. Yes, he had long wanted to meet him. He had heard a great deal about him from the boys, but hitherto he had always maintained an appearance of disdainful indifference when he was mentioned, and he had even criticized what he heard about Alyosha. But secretly he had a great longing to make his acquaintance. There was something sympathetic and attractive in all he was told about Alyosha. So the present moment was important. To begin with, he had to show himself at his best, to show his independence. Or he'll think of me as 13 and take me for a boy, like the rest of them. And what are these boys to him? I shall ask him when I get to know him. It's a pity I'm so short, though. Tuzikov is younger than I am, yet he is half a head taller. But I have a clever face. I'm not good-looking. I know I'm hideous, but I've a clever face. I mustn't talk too freely. If I fall into his arms all at once, he may think... Tfu, how horrible if he should think... Such were the thoughts that excited Kolya while he was doing his utmost to assume the most independent air. What distressed him most was his being so short. He did not mind so much his hideous face as being so short. On the wall in a corner at home he had the year before made a pencil mark to show his height, and every 2 months since he anxiously measured himself against it to see how much he had gained. But alas, he grew very slowly, and this sometimes reduced him almost to despair. His face was in reality by no means hideous. On the contrary, it was rather attractive, with a fair pale skin, freckled. His small lively grey eyes had a fearless look, and often glowed with feeling. He had rather high cheekbones, small, very red, but not very thick lips. His nose was small and unmistakably turned up. "I've a regular puck nose, Kolya used to mutter to himself when he looked in the looking-glass, and he always left it with indignation. But perhaps I haven't got a clever face, he sometimes thought, doubtful even of that. But it must not be supposed that his mind was preoccupied with his face and his height. On the contrary, however bitter the moments before the looking-glass were to him, he quickly forgot them, and forgot them for a long time. Abandoning himself entirely to ideas and to real life, as he formulated it to himself. Alyosha came out quickly and hastened up to Kolya. Before he reached him, Kolya could see that he looked delighted. "Can he be so glad to see me?" Kolya wondered, feeling pleased. We may note here, in passing, that Alyosha's appearance had undergone a complete change since we saw him last. He had abandoned his cassock and was wearing now a well-cut coat, a soft round head, and his hair had been cropped short. All this was very becoming to him, and he looked quite handsome. His charming face always had a good-humoured expression, but there was a gentleness and serenity in his good humour. To Kolya's surprise, Alyosha came out to him just as he was, without an overcoat. He had evidently come in haste. He held out his hand to Kolya at once. "Here you are at last! How anxious we've been to see you!" "There were reasons which you shall know directly. Anyway, I'm glad to make your acquaintance. I've long been hoping for an opportunity and have heard a great deal about you," Kolya muttered, a little breathless. "We should have met anyway. I've heard a great deal about you, too, but you've been a long time coming here." "Tell me, how are things going?" "Ilusha is very ill. He is certainly dying." "How awful! You must admit that medicine is a fraud, Karamazov," cried Kolya warmly. "Ilusha has mentioned you often, very often, even in his sleep, in delirium, you know. One can see that you used to be very, very dear to him, before the incident, with the knife. Then there's another reason. Tell me, is that your dog?" "Yes, Pereshvan." "Not Shuchka?" Alyosha looked at Kolya with eyes full of pity. "Is she lost forever?" "I know you would all like it to be Zhutska. I've heard all about it." Kolya smiled mysteriously. "Listen, Karamazov, I'll tell you all about it. That's what I came for. That's what I asked you to come out here for, to explain the whole episode to you before we go in." He began with animation. "You see, Karamazov, Ilusha came into the preparatory class last spring. Well, you know what our preparatory class is, a lot of small boys. They began teasing Ilusha at once. I am 2 classes higher up, and, of course, I only look on at them from a distance. I saw the boy was weak and small, but he wouldn't give in to them. He fought with them. I saw he was proud, and his eyes were full of fire. I like children like that. And they teased him all the more. The worst of it was he was horribly dressed at the time. His breeches were too small for him, and there were holes in his boots. They worried him about it. They jeered at him. That I can't stand. I stood up for him at once and gave it to them hot. I beat them, but they adore me, do you know, Karamazov?" Kolya boasted impulsively. "But I'm always fond of children. I've 2 chickens in my hands at home now. That's what detained me today. So they left off beating Ilusha, and I took him under my protection. I saw the boy was proud. I tell you that, the boy was proud. But in the end he became slavishly devoted to me. He did my slightest bidding, obeyed me as though I were God, tried to copy me. In the intervals between the classes he used to run to me at once, and I'd go about with him. On Sundays too. They always laugh when an older boy makes friends with a younger one like that, but that's a prejudice. If it's my fancy, that's enough. I am teaching him, developing him. Why shouldn't I develop him, if I like him? Here you, Karamazov, have taken up with all these nestlings. I see you want to influence the younger generation, to develop them, to be of use to them. And I assure you this trait in your character, which I knew by hearsay, attracted me more than anything. Let us get to the point, though. I noticed that there was a sort of softness and sentimentality coming over the boy. And you know, I have a positive hatred of this sheepish sentimentality, and I've had it from a baby. There were contradictions in him too. He was proud, but he was slavishly devoted to me. And yet all at once his eyes would flash and he'd refuse to agree with me. He'd argue, fly into a rage. I used sometimes to propound certain ideas. I could see that it was not so much that he disagreed with the ideas, but that he was simply rebelling against me, because I was cool in responding to his endearments. And so, in order to train him properly, the tenderer he was, the colder I became. I did it on purpose. That was my idea. My object was to form his character, to lick him into shape, to make a man of him. And besides... No doubt you understand me at a word. Suddenly I noticed for 3 days in succession he was downcast and dejected, not because of my coldness, but for something else, something more important. I wondered what the tragedy was. I've pumped him, and found out that he had somehow got to know Smerdyakov, who was footman to your late father. It was before his death, of course, and he taught the little fool a silly trick, that is, a brutal, nasty trick. He told him to take a piece of bread, to stick a pin in it, and to throw it to one of those hungry dogs who snap up anything without biting it, and then to watch and see what would happen. So they prepared a piece of bread like that and threw it to Zhutchka, that shaggy dog there's been such a fuss about. The people of the house it belonged to never fed it at all, though it barked all day. Do you like that stupid barking, Karamazov? I can't stand it. So it rushed at the bread, swallowed it, and began to squeal. It turned round and ran away, squealing as it ran out of sight. That was Ilusha's own account of it. He confessed it to me and cried bitterly. He hugged me, shaking all over. He kept on repeating, "He ran away squealing." The sight of that haunted him. He was tormented by remorse, I could see that. I took it seriously. I determined to give him a lesson for other things as well. So I must confess I wasn't quite straightforward, and pretended to be more indignant perhaps than I was. "You've done a nasty thing," I said. "You're a scoundrel. I won't tell of it, of course, but I shall have nothing more to do with you for a time. I'll think it over and let you know through Smurov. That's the boy who's just come with me. He's always ready to do anything for me. Whether I will have anything to do with you in the future, or whether I give you up for good as a scoundrel." He was tremendously upset. I must own I felt I'd gone too far as I spoke, but there was no help for it. I did what I thought best at the time. A day or two after, I sent Smurov to tell him that I would not speak to him again. That's what we call it when 2 schoolfellows refuse to have anything more to do with one another. Secretly I only meant to send him to Coventry for a few days, and then, if I saw signs of repentance, to hold out my hand to him again. That was my intention. But what do you think happened? He heard Smurov's message. His eyes flashed. "Tell Krasotkin from me," he cried, "that I will throw bread with pins to all the dogs. All of them. So he's gone in for a little temper. We must smoke it out of him." And I began to treat him with contempt. Whenever I met him I turned away or smiled sarcastically. And just then that affair with his father happened. You remember? You must realize that he was fearfully worked up by what had happened already. The boys, seeing I had given him up, set on him and taunted him, shouting, 'Wisp of tow! Wisp of tow!' And he had soon regular skirmishes with them, which I am very sorry for. They seem to have given him one very bad beating. One day he flew at them all as they were coming out of school. I stood a few yards off, looking on. And I swear I don't remember that I laughed. It was quite the other way. I felt awfully sorry for him. In another minute I would have run up to take his part. But he suddenly met my eyes. I don't know what he fancied, but he pulled out a penknife, rushed at me, and struck at my thigh, here in my right leg. I didn't move. I don't mind owning I am plucky sometimes, Karamazov. I simply looked at him contemptuously, as though to say, 'This is how you repay all my kindness. Do it again if you like, I am at your service.' But he didn't stab me again. He broke down. He was frightened at what he had done. He threw away the knife, burst out crying, and ran away. I did not sneak on him, of course, and I made them all keep quiet, so it shouldn't come to the ears of the masters. I didn't even tell my mother till it had healed up, and the wound was a mere scratch. And then I heard that the same day he had been throwing stones and had bitten your finger. But you understand now what a state he was in. Well, it can't be helped. It was stupid of me not to come and forgive him, that is, to make it up with him, when he was taken ill. I am sorry for it now, but I had a special reason, so now I've told you all about it, but I'm afraid it was stupid of me." "Oh, what a pity," exclaimed Alyosha with feeling, "that I didn't know before what terms you were on with him, or I'd have come to you long ago to beg you to go to him with me. Would you believe it, when he was feverish he talked about you in delirium. I didn't know how much you were to him. And you've really not succeeded in finding that dog. His father and the boys have been hunting all over the town for it. Would you believe it, since he's been ill, I've 3 times heard him repeat with tears, 'It's because I killed Zhutchka, father, that I'm ill now. God is punishing me for it.' He can't get that idea out of his head. And if the dog were found and proved to be alive, one might almost fancy the joy would cure him. We have all rested our hopes on you." "Tell me, what made you hope that I should be the one to find him?" Kolya asked, with great curiosity. "Why did you reckon on me rather than anyone else?" "There was a report that you were looking for the dog, and that you would bring it when you found it. Smurov said something of the sort. We've all been trying to persuade Ilusha that the dog is alive and that it's been seen. The boys brought him a live hare. He just looked at it, with a faint smile, and asked them to set it free in the fields. And so we did. His father has just this moment come back, bringing him a mastiff pup, hoping to comfort him with that, but I think it only makes it worse." "Tell me, Karamazov, what sort of man is the father? I know him, but what do you make of him? A mountebank? A buffoon?" "Oh no, there are people of deep feeling who have been somehow crushed. Buffoonery in them is a form of resentful irony against those to whom they daren't speak the truth, from having been for years humiliated and intimidated by them. Believe me, Krasotkin, that sort of buffoonery is sometimes tragic in the extreme. His whole life now is centered in Ilusha, and if Ilusha dies he will either go mad with grief or kill himself. I feel almost certain of that when I look at him now." "I understand you, Karamazov. I see you understand human nature," Kolya added with feeling. "And as soon as I saw you with the dog, I thought it was Zhutchka you were bringing." "Wait a bit, Karamazov. Perhaps we shall find it yet. But this is Pereshvan. I'll let him go in now, and perhaps it will amuse Ilusha more than the mastiff pup. Wait a bit, Karamazov. You'll know something in a minute. But I say, I'm keeping you here," Kolya cried suddenly. "You've no overcoat on in this bitter cold. You see what an egoist I am. Oh, we're all egoists, Karamazov." "Don't trouble. It is cold, but I don't often catch cold. Let us go in, though. And, by the way, what is your name? I know you are called Kolya, but what else?" "Nikolai. Nikolai Ivanovitch Krasotkin, or as they say in official documents, Krasotkin's son." Kolya laughed for some reason, but added suddenly, "Of course I hate my name Nikolai." "Why so?" "It's so trivial, so ordinary." "You are 13?" asked Alyosha. "No, 14. That is, I shall be 14 very soon, in a fortnight. I'll confess one weakness of mine, Karamazov, just to you, since it's our first meeting. so that you may understand my character at once. I hate being asked my age, more than that, and in fact, there is a libelous story going about me that last week I played robbers with the preparatory boys. It's a fact that I did play with them, but it's a perfect libel to say I did it for my own amusement. I have reasons for believing that you've heard the story, but I wasn't playing for my own amusement, it was for the sake of the children, because they couldn't think of anything to do by themselves. But they've always got some silly tale. This is an awful town for gossip, I can tell you. But what if you had been playing for your own amusement? What's the harm? Come, I say, for my own amusement. You don't play horses, do you? But you must look at it like this, said Alyosha, smiling. Grown-up people go to the theatre, and there the adventures of all sorts of heroes are represented. Sometimes there are robbers and battles too, and isn't that just the same thing, in a different form, of course? And young people's games of soldiers or robbers in their playtime are also art in its first stage. You know, they spring from the growing artistic instincts of the young. And sometimes these games are much better than performances in the theatre. The only difference is that people go there to look at the actors, while in these games the young people are the actors themselves. But that's only natural. You think so? Is that your idea? Kolya looked at him intently. Oh, you know, that's rather an interesting view. When I go home I'll think it over. I'll admit I thought I might learn something from you. I've come to learn of you, Karamazov, Kolya concluded, in a voice full of spontaneous feeling. And I of you, said Alyosha, smiling and pressing his hand. Kolya was much pleased with Alyosha. What struck him most was that he treated him exactly like an equal, and that he talked to him just as if he were quite grown up. I'll show you something directly, Karamazov. It's a theatrical performance too, he said, laughing nervously. That's why I've come. Let us go first to the people of the house, on the left. All the boys leave their coats in there, because the room is small and hot. Oh, I'm only coming in for a minute. I'll keep on my overcoat. Perezvon will stay here in the passage and be dead. You see, Perezvon, lie down and be dead. You see how he's dead? I'll go in first and explore, then I'll whistle to him when I think fit, and you'll see he'll dash in like mad. Only Smurov must not forget to open the door at the moment. I'll arrange it all, and you'll see something. End of chapter 4 of book 10. Chapter 5 of The Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 10, Chapter 5. By Ilusha's bedside. The room inhabited by the family of the retired captain Snegiryov is already familiar to the reader. It was close and crowded at that moment with a number of visitors. Several boys were sitting with Ilusha, and though all of them, like Smurov, were prepared to deny that it was Alyosha who had brought them and reconciled them with Ilusha, it was really the fact. All the art he had used had been to take them, one by one, to Ilusha without sheepish sentimentality, appearing to do so casually and without design. It was a great consolation to Ilusha in his suffering. He was greatly touched by seeing the almost tender affection and sympathy shown him by these boys, who had been his enemies. Krasotkin was the only one missing, and his absence was a heavy load on Ilusha's heart. Perhaps the bitterest of all his bitter memories was his stabbing Krasotkin, who had been his one friend and protector. Clever little Smurov, who was the first to make it up with Ilusha, thought it was so. But when Smurov hinted to Krasotkin that Alyosha wanted to come and see him about something, the latter cut him short, bidding Smurov tell Karamazov at once that he knew best what to do, that he wanted no one's advice, and that, if he went to see Ilusha, he would choose his own time, for he had his own reasons. That was a fortnight before this Sunday. That was why Alyosha had not been to see him, as he had meant to. But though he waited, he sent Smurov to him twice again. Both times Krasotkin met him with a curt, impatient refusal, sending Alyosha a message not to bother him any more, that if he came himself, he, Krasotkin, would not go to Ilusha at all. Up to the very last day, Smurov did not know that Kolya meant to go to Ilusha that morning, and only the evening before, as he parted from Smurov, Kolya abruptly told him to wait at home for him next morning, for he would go with him to the Snegiryovs', but wanted him on no account to say he was coming, as he wanted to drop in casually. Smurov obeyed. Smurov's fancy that Kolya would bring back the lost dog was based on the words Kolya had dropped that they must be asses not to find the dog if it was alive. When Smurov, waiting for an opportunity, timidly hinted at his guess about the dog, Krasotkin flew into a violent rage. "I'm not such an ass as to go hunting about the town for other people's dogs when I've got a dog of my own. And how can you imagine a dog could be alive after swallowing a pin? Sheepish sentimentality, that's what it is." For the last fortnight Ilusha had not left his little bed under the icons in the corner. He had not been to school since the day he met Alyosha and bit his finger. He was taken ill the same day, though for a month afterwards he was sometimes able to get up and walk about the room and passage. But latterly he had become so weak that he could not move without help from his father. His father was terribly concerned about him. He even gave up drinking and was almost crazy with terror that his boy would die. And often, especially after leading him around the room on his arm and putting him back to bed, he would run to a dark corner in the passage and, leaning his head against the wall, he would break into paroxysms of violent weeping, stifling his sobs that they might not be heard by Ilusha. Returning to the room, he would usually begin doing something to amuse and comfort his precious boy. He would tell him stories, funny anecdotes, or would mimic comic people he had happened to meet, even imitate the howls and cries of animals. But Ilusha could not bear to see his father fooling and playing the buffoon. Though the boy tried not to show how he disliked it, he saw with an aching heart that his father was an object of contempt, and he was continually haunted by the memory of the wisp of tow and that terrible day. Nina, Ilusha's gentle, crippled sister, did not like her father's buffoonery either. Vavra had been gone for some time past to Petersburg to study at the university. But the half-imbecile mother was greatly diverted and laughed heartily when her husband began capering about or performing something. It was the only way she could be amused. All the rest of the time she was grumbling and complaining that now everyone had forgotten her, that no one treated her with respect, that she was slighted, and so on. But during the last few days she had completely changed. She began looking constantly at Ilusha's bed in the corner and seemed lost in thought. She was more silent, quieter, and, if she cried quietly so as not to be heard. The captain noticed the change in her with mournful perplexity. The boys' visits at first only angered her, but later on their merry shouts and stories began to divert her, and at last she liked them so much that, if the boys had given up coming, she would have felt dreary without them. When the children told some story or played a game, she laughed and clapped her hands. She called some of them to her and kissed them. She was particularly fond of Smurov. As for the captain, the presence in his room of the children, who came to cheer up Ilusha, filled his heart from the first with ecstatic joy. He even hoped that Ilusha would now get over his depression and that would hasten his recovery. In spite of his alarm about Ilusha, he had not, till lately, felt 1 minute's doubt of his boy's ultimate recovery. He met his little visitors with homage, waited upon them hand and foot. He was ready to be their horse and even began letting them ride on his back, but Ilusha did not like the game and it was given up. He began buying little things for them, gingerbread and nuts, gave them tea and cut them sandwiches. It must be noted that all this time he had plenty of money. He had taken the 200 rubles from Katerina Ivanovna just as Ilusha had predicted he would. And afterwards Katerina Ivanovna, learning more about their circumstances and Ilusha's illness, visited them herself, made the acquaintance of the family, and succeeded in fascinating the half-imbecile mother. Since then she had been lavish in helping them, and the captain, terror-stricken at the thought that his boy might be dying, forgot his pride and humbly accepted her assistance. All this time Dr. Herzenstube, who was called in by Katerina Ivanovna, came punctually every other day, but little was gained by his visits, and he dosed the invalid mercilessly. But on that Sunday morning a new doctor was expected, who had come from Moscow, where he had a great reputation. Katerina Ivanovna had sent for him from Moscow at great expense, not expressly for Ilusha, but for another object, of which more will be said in its place hereafter. But, as he had come, she had asked him to see Ilusha as well, and the captain had been told to expect him. He hadn't the slightest idea that Kolya Krasotkin was coming, though he had long wished for a visit from the boy for whom Ilusha was fretting. At the moment when Krasotkin opened the door and came into the room, the captain and all the boys were round Ilusha's bed, looking at a tiny mastiff pup, who had only been born the day before, though the captain had bespoken it a week ago to comfort and amuse Ilusha, who was still fretting over the lost and probably dead Zhutchka. Ilusha, who had heard 3 days before that he was to be presented with a puppy, not an ordinary puppy, but a pedigree mastiff, a very important point of course, tried from delicacy of feeling to pretend that he was pleased. But his father and the boys could not help seeing that the puppy only served to recall to his little heart the thought of the unhappy dog he had killed. The puppy lay beside him feebly moving, and he, smiling sadly, stroked it with his thin, pale, wasted hand. Clearly he liked the puppy, but it wasn't Zhutchka. If he could have had Zhutchka and the puppy too, then he would have been completely happy. "Krasotkin!" cried one of the boys suddenly. He was the first to see him come in. Krasotkin's entrance made a general sensation. The boys moved away and stood on each side of the bed, so that he could get a full view of Ilusha. The captain ran eagerly to meet Kolya. "Please come in, you're welcome," he said hurriedly. "Ilusha, Mr. Krasotkin has come to see you." But Krasotkin, shaking hands with him hurriedly, instantly showed his complete knowledge of the manners of good society. He turned first to the captain's wife sitting in her armchair, who was very ill-humoured at the moment, and was grumbling that the boys stood between her and Ilusha's bed and did not let her see the new puppy. With the greatest courtesy he made her a bow, scraping his foot, and turning to Nina he made her, as the only other lady present, a similar bow. This polite behaviour made an extremely favourable impression on the deranged lady. "There, you can see at once he is a young man that has been well brought up," she commented aloud, throwing up her hands. "But as for our other visitors, they come in one on the top of another." "How do you mean, Mamma, one on the top of another? How is that?" muttered the captain affectionately, though a little anxious on her account. "That's how they ride in. They get on each other's shoulder in the passage and prance in like that on a respectable family. Strange sort of visitors." "But who's come in like that, Mamma?" "Why, that boy came in riding on that one's back, and this one on that one's." Kolya was already by Ilusha's bedside. The sick boy turned visibly paler. He raised himself in the bed and looked intently at Kolya. Kolya had not seen his little friend for 2 months, and he was overwhelmed at the sight of him. He had never imagined that he would see such a wasted, yellow face, such enormous, feverishly glowing eyes, and such thin little hands. He saw, with grieved surprise, Ilusha's rapid, hard breathing and dry lips. He stepped close to him, held out his hand, and, almost overwhelmed, he said: "Well, old man, how are you?" But his voice failed him. He couldn't achieve an appearance of ease. His face suddenly twitched and the corners of his mouth quivered. Ilusha smiled a pitiful little smile, still unable to utter a word. Something moved Kolya to raise his hand and pass it over Ilusha's hair. "Never mind," he murmured softly to him to cheer him up, or perhaps not knowing why he said it. For a minute they were silent again. "Hallo, so you've got a new puppy?" Kolya said suddenly, in a most callous voice. "Yes," answered Ilusha in a long whisper, gasping for breath. "A black nose, that means he'll be fierce, a good house dog," Kolya observed gravely and stolidly, as if the only thing he cared about was the puppy and its black nose. But in reality he still had to do his utmost to control his feelings not to burst out crying like a child, and do what he would, he could not control it. "When it grows up, you'll have to keep it on the chain, I'm sure." "He'll be a huge dog," cried one of the boys. "Of course he will. A mastiff, large, like this, as big as a calf," shouted several voices. "As big as a calf, as a real calf," chimed in the captain. "I got one like that on purpose, one of the fiercest breed, and his parents are huge and very fierce. They stand as high as this from the floor. Sit down here on Ilusha's bed, or here on the bench. "You are welcome. We've been hoping to see you a long time. You were so kind as to come with Alexei Fyodorovitch?" Krasotkin sat on the edge of the bed at Ilusha's feet. Though he had perhaps prepared a free and easy opening for the conversation on his way, now he completely lost the thread of it. "No, I came with Perezvon. I've got a dog now called Perezvon, a Slavonic name. He's out there. If I whistle he'll run in. I've brought a dog too," he said, addressing Ilusha all at once. "Do you remember Zhutzka, old man?" He suddenly fired the question at him. Ilusha's little face quivered. He looked with an agonized expression at Kolya. Alyosha, standing at the door, frowned and signed to Kolya not to speak of Zhutzka, but he did not or would not notice. "Where is Zhutzka?" Ilusha asked in a broken voice. "Oh well, my boy, your Zhutzka's lost and done for." Ilusha did not speak, but he fixed an intent gaze once more on Kolya. Alyosha, catching Kolya's eye, signed to him vigorously again, but he turned away his eyes, pretending not to have noticed. "It must have run away and died somewhere. It must have died after a meal like that," Kolya pronounced pitilessly, though he seemed a little breathless. "But I've got a dog, Perezvon, a Slavonic name. I've brought him to show you." "I don't want him," said Ilusha suddenly. No, you really must see him. It will amuse you. I brought him on purpose. He's the same sort of shaggy dog. You allow me to call in my dog, madam?" He suddenly addressed Madame Snegiryov, with an inexplicable excitement in his manner. "I don't want him! I don't want him!" cried Ilusha with a mournful break in his voice. There was a reproachful light in his eyes. "You'd better." The captain started up from the chest by the wall on which he had just sat down. "You'd better... another time," he muttered. But Kolya could not be restrained. He hurriedly shouted to Smurov, "Open the door!" and as soon as it was open he blew his whistle. Perezvon dashed headlong into the room. "Jump, Perezvon, beg, beg!" shouted Kolya, jumping up, and the dog stood erect on its hind legs by Ilusha's bedside. What followed was a surprise to everyone. Ilusha started, lurched violently forward, bent over Perezvon and gazed at him, faint with suspense. "It's Zhutzka!" he cried suddenly, in a voice breaking with joy and suffering. "And who did you think it was?" Krasotkin shouted with all his might, in a ringing, happy voice, and bending down he seized the dog and lifted him up to Ilusha. "Look, old man, you see, blind of one eye, and the left ear is torn, just the marks you described to me. It was by that I found him. I found him directly. He did not belong to anyone," he explained, to the captain, to his wife, to Alyosha, and then again to Ilusha. "He used to live in the Fedotovs' backyard. Though he made his home there, they did not feed him. He was a stray dog that had run away from the village. I found him. You see, old man, he couldn't have swallowed what you gave him. If he had, he must have died. He must have. So he must have spat it out, since he is alive. You did not see him do it. But the pin pricked his tongue, that's why he squealed. He ran away squealing, and you thought he'd swallowed it. He might well squeal, because the skin of dogs' mouths is so tender. Tenderer than in man, much tenderer," Kolya cried impetuously, his face glowing and radiant with delight. Ilusha could not speak. White as a sheet, he gazed open-mouthed at Kolya, with his great eyes almost starting out of his head. And if Krasotkin, who had no suspicion of it, had known what a disastrous and fatal effect such a moment might have on the sick child's health, nothing would have induced him to play such a trick on him. But Alyosha was perhaps the only person in the room who realized it. As for the captain, he behaved like a small child. "Zhutzka! It's Zhutzka!" he cried in a blissful voice. "Ilusha, this is Zhutzka! You're Zhutzka! Mamma, this is Zhutzka!" He was almost weeping. "And I never guessed!" cried Smurov regretfully. "Bravo, Krasotkin! I said he'd find the dog, and here he's found him." "Here he's found him!" another boy repeated gleefully. "Krasotkin's a brick!" cried a third voice. "He's a brick! He's a brick!" cried the other boys, and they began clapping. "Wait, wait!" Krasotkin did his utmost to shout above them all. "I'll tell you how it happened, that's the whole point. I found him, I took him home and hid him at once. I kept him locked up at home and did not show him to anyone till today. Only Smurf has known for the last fortnight, but I assured him this dog was called Persivan, and he did not guess. And meanwhile I taught the dog all sorts of tricks. You should only see all the things he can do. I trained him so as to bring you a well-trained dog, in good condition, old man, so as to be able to say to you, 'See, old man, what a fine dog your Zhutchka is now.' Haven't you a bit of meat? He'll show you a trick that will make you die with laughing. A piece of meat, haven't you got any?" The captain ran across the passage to the landlady, where their cooking was done. Not to lose precious time, Kolya, in desperate haste, shouted to Percival, "Dead!" And the dog immediately turned round and lay on his back, with its 4 paws in the air. The boys laughed. Ilusha looked on with the same suffering smile, but the person most delighted with the dog's performance was Mamma. She laughed at the dog and began snapping her fingers and calling it "Perezvon, Perezvon." "Nothing will make him get up, nothing!" Kolya cried triumphantly, proud of his success. "He won't move for all the shouting in the world, but if I call to him, he'll jump up in a minute. Ici, Perezvon!" The dog leapt up and bounded about, whining with delight. The captain ran back with a piece of cooked beef. "Is it hot?" Kolya inquired hurriedly, with a businesslike air, taking the meat. "Dogs don't like hot things. No, it's all right. Look, everybody, look, Ilusha, look, old man. Why aren't you looking? He does not look at him, now I've brought him." The new trick consisted in making the dog stand motionless with his nose out and putting a tempting morsel of meat just on his nose. The luckless dog had to stand without moving, with the meat on his nose, as long as his master chose to keep him, without a movement, perhaps for half an hour. But he kept Perezvon only for a brief moment. "Paid for!" cried Kolya, and the meat passed in a flash from the dog's nose to his mouth. The audience, of course, expressed enthusiasm and surprise. "Can you really have put off coming all this time, simply to train the dog?" exclaimed Alyosha, with an involuntary note of reproach in his voice. "Simply for that," answered Kolya with perfect simplicity. "I wanted to show him in all his glory." "Perezvon, Perezvon!" called Ilusha suddenly, snapping his thin fingers and beckoning to the dog. "What is it? Let him jump up on the bed. Ici, Perezvon!" Kolya slapped the bed, and Perezvon darted up by Ilusha. The boy threw both arms round his head, and Perezvon instantly licked his cheek. Ilusha crept close to him, stretched himself out in bed, and hid his face in the dog's shaggy coat. "Dear, dear!" kept exclaiming the captain. Kolya sat down again on the edge of the bed. "Ilusha, I can show you another trick. I've brought you a little cannon. You remember I told you about it before, and you said how much you'd like to see it. Well, here, I've brought it to you." And Kolya hurriedly pulled out of his satchel the little bronze cannon. He hurried because he was happy himself. Another time he would have waited till the sensation made by Perezvon had passed off. Now he hurried on, regardless of all consideration. "You're all happy now," he felt, "so here's something to make you happier." He was perfectly enchanted himself. "I've been coveting this thing for a long while. It's for you, old man, it's for you. It belonged to Morozov. It was no use to him. He had it from his brother. I swapped a book from father's bookcase for it, A Kinsman of Mohammed, or Salutary Folly, a scandalous book published in Moscow 100 years ago, before they had any censorship. And Morozov has a taste for such things. He was grateful to me too." Kolya held the cannon in his hand so that all could see and admire it. Ilusha raised himself, and, with his right arm still round the dog, he gazed enchanted at the toy. The sensation was even greater when Kolya announced that he had gunpowder too, and that it could be fired off at once. "If it won't alarm the ladies." Mamma immediately asked to look at the toy closer, and her request was granted. She was much pleased with the little bronze cannon on wheels, and began rolling it to and fro on her lap. She readily gave permission for the cannon to be fired, without any idea of what she had been asked. Kolya showed the powder and the shot. The captain, as a military man, undertook to load it, putting in a minute quantity of powder. He asked that the shot might be put off till another time. The cannon was put on the floor, aiming towards an empty part of the room. 3 grains of powder were thrust into the touch-hole, and a match was put to it. A magnificent explosion followed. Mamma was startled, but at once laughed with delight. The boys gazed in speechless triumph, but the captain, looking at Ilusha, was more enchanted than any of them. Kolya picked up the cannon and immediately presented it to Ilusha, together with the powder and the shot. "I got it for you, for you! I've been keeping it for you a long time," he repeated once more in his delight. "Oh, give it to me! No, give me the cannon!" Mamma began begging like a little child. Her face showed a piteous fear that she would not get it. Kolya was disconcerted. The captain fidgeted uneasily. "Mamma, Mamma!" he ran to her. "The cannon's yours, of course, but let Ilusha have it, because it's a present to him, but it's just as good as yours. Ilusha will always let you play with it. It shall belong to both of you, both of you." "No, I don't want it to belong to both of us. I want it to be mine altogether, not Ilusha's," persisted Mamma, on the point of tears. "Take it, mother. Here, keep it," Ilusha cried. "Krasotkin, may I give it to my mother?" He turned to Krasotkin with an imploring face, as though he were afraid he might be offended at his giving his present to someone else. "Of course you may," Krasotkin assented heartily, and, taking the cannon from Ilusha, he handed it himself to Mamma with a polite bow. She was so touched that she cried. "Ilusha, darling, he's the one who loves his Mamma," she said tenderly, and at once began wheeling the cannon to and fro on her lap again. "Mamma, let me kiss your hand." The captain darted up to her at once and did so. "And I never saw such a charming fellow as this nice boy," said the grateful lady, pointing to Krasotkin. "And I'll bring you as much powder as you like, Ilusha. We make the powder ourselves, you know. Borovikov found out how it's made. 24 parts of saltpeter, 10 of sulphur, and 6 of birchwood charcoal. It's all pounded together, mixed into a paste with water, and rubbed through a tammy sieve. That's how it's done." "Smurov told me about your powder, only father says it's not real gunpowder," responded Ilusha. "Not real?" Kolya flushed. "It burns? I don't know, of course." "No, I didn't mean that," put in the captain with a guilty face. "I only said that real powder is not made like that, but that's nothing, it can be made so." "I don't know, you know best. We lighted some in a pomatum pot. It burned splendidly, it all burned away, leaving only a tiny ash. But that was only the paste, and if you rub it through... But of course you know best, I don't know. And Belkin's father thrashed him on account of our powder, did you hear?" He turned to Ilusha. "We had prepared a whole bottle of it, and he used to keep it under his bed. His father saw it. He said it might explode, and thrashed him on the spot. He was going to make a complaint against me to the masters. He's not allowed to go about with me now. No one is allowed to go about with me now. Smurov is not allowed to either. I've got a bad name with everyone. They say I'm a desperate character." Kolya smiled scornfully. "It all began from what happened on the railway." "Ah, we've heard of that exploit of yours too," cried the captain. "How could you lie still on the line? Is it possible you weren't the least afraid, lying there under the train? Weren't you frightened?" The captain was abject in his flattery of Kolya. "Not particularly," answered Kolya carelessly. "What's blasted my reputation more than anything here was that cursed goose," he said, turning again to Ilusha, but though he assumed an unconcerned air as he talked, he still could not control himself and was continually missing the note he tried to keep up. "Ah, I heard about the goose," Ilusha laughed, beaming all over. "They told me, but I didn't understand. Did they really take you to the court?" "The most stupid, trivial affair. They made a mountain of a molehill, as they always do," Kolya began carelessly. "I was walking through the marketplace here one day, just when they'd driven in the geese. I stopped and looked at them. All at once a fellow, who is an errand boy at Plotnikov's now, looked at me and said, 'What are you looking at the geese for?' I looked at him. He was a stupid, moon-faced fellow of 20. I'm always on the side of the peasantry, you know. I like talking to the peasants. We've dropped behind the peasants. That's an axiom. I believe you're laughing, Karamazov." "No, heaven forbid, I'm listening," said Alyosha with a most good-natured air, and the sensitive Kolya was immediately reassured. "My theory, Karamazov, is clear and simple," he hurried on again, looking pleased. "I believe in the people, and am always glad to give them their due, but I'm not for spoiling them. That is a sine qua non. But I was telling you about the goose. So I turned to the fool and answered, 'I'm wondering what the goose thinks about.' He looked at me quite stupidly. 'And what does the goose think about?' he asked. 'Do you see that cart full of oats?' I said. 'The oats are dropping out of the sack, and the goose has put its neck right under the wheel to gobble them up, do you see?' 'I see that quite well,' he said. 'Well,' said I, 'if that cart were to move on a little, would it break the goose's neck or not?' 'It'd be sure to break it,' and he grinned all over his face, highly delighted. 'Come on then,' said I, 'let's try.' 'Let's,' he said, and it did not take us long to arrange. He stood at the bridle without being noticed, and I stood on one side to direct the goose. And the owner wasn't looking, he was talking to someone, so I had nothing to do. The goose thrust its head in after the oats of itself, under the cart, just under the wheel. I winked at the lad, he tugged at the bridle, and crack! The goose's neck was broken in half. And, as luck would have it, all the peasants saw us at that moment, and they kicked up a shindy at once. 'You did that on purpose.' 'No, not on purpose.' 'Yes, you did, on purpose.' Well, they shouted, 'Take him to the justice of the peace.' They took me too. 'You were there too,' they said. 'You helped. You are known all over the market.' And, for some reason, I really am known all over the market," Kolya added conceitedly. "We all went off to the justices. They brought the goose too. The fellow was crying in a great funk, simply blubbering like a woman. And the farmer kept shouting that you could kill any number of geese like that. Well, of course, there were witnesses. The justice of the peace settled it in a minute, that the farmer was to be paid a rouble for the goose, and the fellow to have the goose. And he was warned not to play such pranks again. And the fellow kept blubbering like a woman. 'It wasn't me,' he said. 'It was he egged me on,' and he pointed to me. I answered with the utmost composure that I hadn't egged him on, that I simply stated the general proposition, had spoken hypothetically. The justice of the peace smiled and was vexed with himself once for having smiled. 'I'll complain to your masters of you, so that for the future you mayn't waste your time on such general propositions, instead of sitting at your books and learning your lessons.' He didn't complain to the masters, that was a joke, but the matter noised abroad and came to the ears of the masters. Their ears are long, you know. The classical master, Kolbasnikov, was particularly shocked about it, but Dardanelov got me off again. But Kolbasnikov is savage with everyone now, like a green ass. Did you know, Ilusha, he's just married, got a dowry of 1,000 roubles, and his bride's a regular fright of the first rank and the last degree. The third-class fellows wrote an epigram on it. 'Astounding news has reached the class. Kolbasnikov has been an ass.' And so on. Awfully funny. I'll bring it to you later on. I say nothing against Dardanelov. He's a learned man. There's no doubt about it. I respect men like that, and it's not because he stood up for me." "But you took him down about the founders of Troy," Smurov put in suddenly, proud of Kosotkin at such a moment. He was particularly pleased with the story of the goose. "Did you really take him down?" the captain inquired in a flattering way. "On the question who founded Troy? We heard of it. Ilusha told me about it at the time." "He knows everything, father. He knows more than any of us," put in Ilusha. "He only pretends to be like that, but really he is top in every subject." Ilusha looked at Kolya with infinite happiness. "Oh, that's all nonsense about Troy, a trivial matter. I consider this an unimportant question," said Kolya with haughty humility. He had by now completely recovered his dignity, though he was still a little uneasy. He felt that he was greatly excited and that he had talked about the goose, for instance, with too little reserve, while Alyosha had looked serious and had not said a word all the time. And the vain boy began by degrees to have a rankling fear that Alyosha was silent because he despised him, and thought he was showing off before him. If he dared to think anything like that, Kolya would... "I regard the question as quite a trivial one," he rapped out again, proudly. "And I know who founded Troy," a boy who had not spoken before said suddenly, to the surprise of everyone. He was silent and seemed to be shy. He was a pretty boy of about 11, called Kartashov. He was sitting near the door. Kolya looked at him with dignified amazement. The fact was that the identity of the founders of Troy had become a secret for the whole school, a secret which could only be discovered by reading Smaragdov, and no one at Smaragdov but Kolya. One day, when Kolya's back was turned, Kartashov hastily opened Smaragdov, which lay among Kolya's books, and immediately lighted on the passage relating to the foundation of Troy. This was a good time ago, but he felt uneasy and could not bring himself to announce publicly that he too knew who had founded Troy, afraid of what might happen and of Krasotkin's somehow putting him to shame over it. But now he couldn't resist saying it. For weeks he had been longing to. "Well, who did found it?" Kolya, turning to him with haughty superciliousness. He saw from his face that he really did know, and at once made up his mind how to take it. There was, so to speak, a discordant note in the general harmony. "Troy was founded by Teucer, Dardanus, Ilius, and Tros," the boy rapped out at once, and in the same instant he blushed so that it was painful to look at him. But the boys stared at him for a whole minute, and then all the staring eyes turned at once and were fastened upon Kolya, who was still scanning the audacious boy with disdainful composure. "In what sense did they found it?" he deigned to comment at last. "And what is meant by founding a city or a state? What do? Did they go and each lay a brick, do you suppose?" There was laughter. The offending boy turned from pink to crimson. He was silent and on the point of tears. Kolya held him so for a minute. "Before you talk of a historical event like the foundation of a nationality, you must first understand what you mean by it," he admonished him in stern, incisive tones. "But I attach no consequence to these old wives' tales, and I don't think much of universal history in general," he added carelessly, addressing the company generally. "Universal history?" the captain inquired, looking almost scared. "Yes, universal history. It's the study of the successive follies of mankind, and nothing more. The only subjects I respect are mathematics and natural science," said Kolya. He was showing off, and he stole a glance at Alyosha. His was the only opinion he was afraid of there. But Alyosha was still silent and still serious as before. If Alyosha had said a word it would have stopped him. But Alyosha was silent, and it might be the silence of contempt, and that finally irritated Kolya. "The classical languages too. They are simply madness, nothing more. You seem to disagree with me again, Karamazov?" "I don't agree," said Alyosha, with a faint smile. "The study of the classics, if you ask my opinion, is simply a police measure. That's simply why it has been introduced into our schools." By degrees Kolya began to get breathless again. "Latin and Greek were introduced because they are a bore and because they stupefy the intellect. It was dull before, so what could they do to make things duller? It was senseless enough before, so what could they do to make it more senseless? So they thought of Greek and Latin. That's my opinion. I hope I shall never change it," Kolya finished abruptly. His cheeks were flushed. "That's true," assented Smurov suddenly, in a ringing tone of conviction. He had listened attentively. "And yet he is first in Latin himself," cried one of the group of boys suddenly. "Yes, father, he says that, and yet he is first in Latin," echoed Ilusha. What of it? Kolya thought fit to defend himself, though the praise was very sweet to him. "I'm fagging away at Latin because I have to, because I promised my mother to pass my examination, and I think that whatever you do, it's worth doing it well. But in my soul I have a profound contempt for the classics and all that fraud. You don't agree, Karamazov?" "Why fraud?" Alyosha smiled again. "Well, all the classical authors have been translated into all languages, so it was not for the sake of studying the classics they introduced Latin, but solely as a police measure, to stupefy the intelligence. So what can one call it but a fraud?" "Why, who taught you all this?" cried Alyosha, surprised at last. "In the first place, I am capable of thinking for myself without being taught. Besides, what I said just now about the classics being translated, our teacher Kolbasnikov has said to the whole of the 3rd class." "The doctor has come!" cried Nina, who had been silent till then. A carriage belonging to Madame Hohlakov drove up to the gate. The captain, who had been expecting the doctor all the morning, rushed headlong out to meet him. Mamma pulled herself together and assumed a dignified air. Alyosha went up to Ilusha and began setting his pillows straight. Nina, from her invalid chair, anxiously watched him putting the bed tidy. The boys hurriedly took leave. Some of them promised to come again in the evening. Kolya called Perezvon and the dog jumped off the bed. "I won't go away, I won't go away," Kolya said hastily to Ilusha. "I'll wait in the passage and come back when the doctor's gone. I'll come back with Perezvon." But by now the doctor had entered, an important-looking person with long, dark whiskers and a shiny, shaven chin, wearing a bearskin coat. As he crossed the threshold he stopped, taken aback. He probably fancied he had come to the wrong place. "How's this? Where am I?" he muttered, not removing his coat nor his peaked sealskin cap. The crowd, the poverty of the room, the washing hanging on a line in the corner, puzzled him. The captain, bent double, was bowing low before him. "It's here, sir, he muttered cringingly. "It's here, you've come right, you were coming to us." "Snegiryov?" the doctor said loudly and pompously. "Mr. Snegiryov, is that you?" "That's me, sir." "Ah!" The doctor looked round the room with a squeamish air once more and threw off his coat, displaying to all eyes the grand decoration at his neck. The captain caught the fur coat in the air and the doctor took off his cap. "Where is the patient?" he asked emphatically. End of Chapter 5 of Book 10. Chapter 6 of The Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, translated by Constance Garnett. Book 10, Chapter 6. Precocity. "What do you think the doctor will say to him?" Kolya asked quickly. "What a repulsive mug, though, hasn't he? I can't endure medicine." "Ilusha is dying, I think that's certain," answered Alyosha, mournfully. "They're rogues. Medicine's a fraud. I'm glad to have made your acquaintance, though, Karamazov. I wanted to know you for a long time. I'm only sorry we meet in such sad circumstances." Kolya had a great inclination to say something even warmer and more demonstrative, but he felt ill at ease. Alyosha noticed this, smiled and pressed his hand. "I've long learned to respect you as a rare person," Kolya muttered again, faltering and uncertain. "I've heard you're a mystic and have been in a monastery. I know you're a mystic, but that hasn't put me off. Contact with real life will cure you. It's always so with characters like yours." "What do you mean by mystic? Cure me of what?" Alyosha was rather astonished. "Oh, God and all the rest of it." "What? Don't you believe in God?" "Oh, I've nothing against God. Of course, God is only a hypothesis, but I admit that he is needed for the order of the universe and all that, and that if there were no God he would have to be invented," added Kolya, beginning to blush. He suddenly fancied that Alyosha might think he was trying to show off his knowledge and to prove that he was grown up. "I haven't the slightest desire to show off my knowledge to him," Kolya thought indignantly, and all of a sudden he felt horribly annoyed. "I must confess I can't endure entering on such discussions," he said with a final air. "It's possible for one who doesn't believe in God to love mankind, don't you think so? Voltaire didn't believe in God and loved mankind." "I'm at it again," he thought to himself. "Voltaire believed in God, though not very much, I think, and I don't think he loved mankind very much either," said Alyosha, quietly, gently, and quite naturally, as though he were talking to someone of his own age, or even older. Kolya was particularly struck by Alyosha's apparent diffidence about his opinion of Voltaire. He seemed to be leaving the question for him, little Kolya, to settle. "Have you read Voltaire?" Alyosha finished. "No, not to say read, but I've read Candide in the Russian translation, in an absurd, grotesque, old translation." "At it again! Again!" "And did you understand it?" "Oh, yes, everything. That is, why do you suppose I shouldn't understand it? There's a lot of nastiness in it, of course. Of course I can understand that it's a philosophical novel and written to advocate an idea." Kolya was getting mixed by now. "I am a socialist, Karamazov. I am an incurable socialist," he announced suddenly, apropos of nothing. "A socialist?" laughed Alyosha. "But when have you had time to become one? Why, I thought you were only 13." Kolya winced. "In the first place, I'm not 13, but 14. 14 in a fortnight," he flushed angrily. "And in the second place, I'm at a complete loss to understand what my age has to do with it. The question is, what are my convictions, not what is my age, isn't it?" "When you are older, you'll understand for yourself the influence of age on convictions. I fancied, too, that you were not expressing your own ideas," Alyosha answered serenely and modestly, but Kolya interrupted him hotly. "Come, you want obedience and mysticism. You must admit that the Christian religion, for instance, has only been of use to the rich and the powerful to keep the lower classes in slavery. That's so, isn't it?" "Ah, I know where you read that, and I'm sure someone told you so," cried Alyosha. "I say, what makes you think I read it? And certainly no one told so. I can think for myself. I'm not opposed to Christ, if you like. He was a most humane person, and if he were alive today, he would be found in the ranks of the revolutionists, and would perhaps play a conspicuous part. There's no doubt about that." "Oh, where did you get that from? What fool have you made friends with?" exclaimed Alyosha. "Come, the truth will out. It has so chanced that I have often talked to Mr. Rakitin, of course, but old Bielinski said that too, so they say." "Bielinski? I don't remember. He hasn't written that anywhere." "If he didn't write it, they say he said it. I heard that from a... but never mind." "And have you read Bielinski?" "Well, no. I haven't read all of him, but I read the passage about Tatiana, why she didn't go off with Onyegin." "Didn't go off with Onyegin? Surely you don't... understand that already?" "Why, you seem to take me for little Smurov," said Kolya, with a grin of irritation. "But please don't suppose I'm such a revolutionist. I often disagree with Mr. Rakitin. Though I mentioned Tatiana, I'm not at all for the emancipation of women. I acknowledge that women are a subject race and must obey. Les femmes tricotant, Napoleon said. Translator's note: let the women knit. Kolya, for some reason, smiled. And on that question at least, I'm quite of one mind with that pseudo-great man. I think, too, that to leave one's own country and fly to America is mean, worse than mean, silly. Why go to America when one may be of great service to humanity here? Now especially. There's a perfect mass of fruitful activity open to us. That's what I answered." "What do you mean? Answered whom? Has someone suggested you're going to America already?" "I must own they've been at me to go, but I declined. That's between ourselves, of course, Karamazov. Do you hear? Not a word to anyone. I say this only to you. I am not at all anxious to fall into the clutches of the secret police and take lessons at the chain bridge. Long will you remember the house at the chain bridge. Do you remember? It's splendid. Why are you laughing? You don't suppose I'm fibbing, do you? What if you should find out that I've only that one number of the Bell in father's bookcase and haven't read any more of it?" Kolya thought with a shudder. "Oh no, I'm not laughing, and don't suppose for a moment that you are lying. No, indeed, I can't suppose so, for all this, alas, is perfectly true. But tell me, have you read Pushkin? Onyegin, for instance? You spoke just now of Tatiana." "No, I haven't read it yet, but I want to read it. I have no prejudices, Karamazov. I want to hear both sides. What makes you ask?" "Oh, nothing." "Tell me, Karamazov, have you an awful contempt for me?" Kolya rapped out suddenly, and drew himself up before Alyosha, as though he were on drill. "Be so kind as to tell me, without beating about the bush." "I have a contempt for you?" Alyosha looked at him wondering. "What for? I'm only sad that a charming nature such as yours should be perverted by all this crude nonsense before you have begun life." "Don't be anxious about my nature," Kolya interrupted, not without complacency. "But it's true that I am stupidly sensitive, crudely sensitive. You smiled just now, and I fancied you seemed to—" "Oh, my smile meant something quite different. I'll tell you why I smiled. Not long ago I read the criticism made by a German who had lived in Russia on our students and schoolboys of today. 'Show a Russian schoolboy,' he writes, 'a map of the stars, which he knows nothing about, and he will give you back the map next day with corrections on it. No knowledge and unbounded conceit,' that's what the German meant to say about the Russian schoolboy." "Yes, that's perfectly right." Kolya laughed suddenly. "Exactly so. Bravo the German! But he did not see the good side. What do you think? Conceit may be, that comes from youth. That will be corrected if need be. But, on the other hand, there is an independent spirit almost from childhood, boldness of thought and conviction, and not the spirit of these sausage makers, grovelling before authority. But the German was right all the same. Bravo the German! But Germans want strangling all the same. Though they are so good at science and learning, they must be strangled." "Strangled? What for?" smiled Alyosha. "Well, perhaps I am talking nonsense, I agree. I'm awfully childish sometimes, and when I am pleased about anything I can't restrain myself and am ready to talk any stuff. But, I say, we're chattering away here about nothing, and that doctor has been a long time in there. But perhaps he's examining the mamma and that poor crippled Nina. I like that Nina, you know. She whispered to me suddenly as I was coming away, 'Why didn't you come before?' And in such a voice, so reproachfully. I think she is awfully nice and pathetic." "Yes, yes. Well, you'll be coming often, you will see what she's like. It would do you a great deal of good to know people like that, to learn to value a great deal which you will find out from knowing these people," Alyosha observed warmly. "That would have more effect on you than anything." "Oh, how I regret and blame myself for not having come sooner!" Kolya exclaimed with bitter feeling. "Yes, it's a great pity. You saw for yourself how delighted the poor child was to see you, and how he fretted for you to come." "Don't tell me! You make it worse. But it serves me right. What kept me from coming was my conceit, my egoistic vanity, and the beastly willfulness which I never can get rid of, though I've been struggling with it all my life. I see that now. I'm a beast in lots of ways, Karamazov." "No, you have a charming nature, though it's been distorted, and I quite understand why you have had such an influence on this generous, morbidly sensitive boy," Alyosha answered warmly. "And you say that to me!" cried Kolya. "And would you believe it, I've thought several times since I've been here, that you despised me. If only you knew how I prize your opinion." "But are you really so sensitive? At your age? Would you believe it, just now, when you were telling your story, I thought, as I watched you, that you must be very sensitive." "You thought so? What an eye you've got, I say. I bet that was when I was talking about the goose. That was just when I was fancying you had a great contempt for me for being in such a hurry to show off, and for a moment I quite hated you for it, and began talking like a fool. Then I fancied, just now, here, when I said that if there were no God he would have to be invented, that I was in too great a hurry to display my knowledge, especially as I got that phrase out of a book. But I swear I wasn't showing off out of vanity, though I really don't know why. Because I was so pleased? Yes, I believe it was because I was so pleased. Though it's perfectly disgraceful for anyone to be gushing directly they are pleased, I know that. But I'm convinced now that you don't despise me. It was all my imagination. Oh, Karamazov, I'm profoundly unhappy. I sometimes fancy all sorts of things, that everyone is laughing at me, the whole world, and then I feel ready to overturn the whole order of things." "And you worry everyone about you," smiled Alyosha. "Yes, I worry everyone about me, especially my mother. Karamazov, tell me, am I very ridiculous now?" "Don't think about that. Don't think of it at all," cried Alyosha. "And what does the ridiculous mean? Isn't everyone constantly being or seeming ridiculous? Besides, nearly all clever people now are fearfully afraid of being ridiculous, and that makes them unhappy. All I am surprised at is that you should be feeling that so early, though I've observed it for some time past, not only in you. Nowadays the very children have begun to suffer from it. It's almost a sort of insanity. The devil has taken the form of that vanity and entered into the whole generation. It's simply the devil," added Alyosha, without a trace of the smile that Kolya, staring at him, expected to see. "You are like everyone else," said Alyosha in conclusion. "That is, like very many others. Only you must not be like everybody else, that's all." "Even if everyone is like that?" "Yes, even if everyone is like that. You be the only one not like it. You really are not like everyone else. Here you are not ashamed to confess to something bad and even ridiculous, and who will admit so much in these days? No one. And people have even ceased to feel the impulse to self-criticism. Don't be like everyone else, even if you are the only one." "Splendid! I was not mistaken in you. You know how to console one. Oh, how I have longed to know you, Karamazov! I have long been eager for this meeting. Can you really have thought about me too? You said just now that you thought of me too." "Yes, I'd heard of you and had thought of you too. And if it's partly vanity that makes you ask, it doesn't matter." "Do you know, Karamazov, our talk has been like a declaration of love," said Kolya in a bashful and melting voice. "That's not ridiculous, is it?" "Not at all ridiculous, and if it were, it wouldn't matter, because it's been a good thing." Alyosha smiled brightly. "But do you know, Karamazov, you must admit that you are a little ashamed yourself now. I see it by your eyes." Kolya smiled with a sort of sly happiness. "Why ashamed?" "Well, why are you blushing?" "It was you made me blush," laughed Alyosha, and he really did blush. "Oh well, I am a little, goodness knows why. I don't know," he muttered, almost embarrassed. "Oh, how I love you and admire you at this moment, just because you are rather ashamed. Because you are just like me," cried Kolya in positive ecstasy. His cheeks glowed, his eyes beamed. "You know, Kolya, you will be very unhappy in your life," something made Alyosha say suddenly. I know. How you know it all beforehand," Kolya agreed at once. "But you will bless life on the whole all the same." "Just so! Hurrah! You're a prophet! Oh, we shall get on together, Karamazov. Do you know, what delights me most is that you treat me quite like an equal. But we are not equals. No, we are not. You are better. But we shall get on. Do you know, all this last month I've been saying to myself, 'Either we shall be friends at once, forever, or we shall part enemies to the grave.'" "And saying that, of course, you loved me," Alyosha laughed gaily. "I did. I loved you awfully. I've been loving and dreaming of you. And how do you know it all beforehand? Ah, here's the doctor. Goodness, what will he tell us? Look at his face." End of chapter 6 of book 10. Chapter 7 of The Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, translated by Constance Garnett. Book 10, Chapter 7, Ilusha. The doctor came out of the room again, muffled in his fur coat and with his cap on his head. His face looked almost angry and disgusted, as though he were afraid of getting dirty. He cast a cursory glance round the passage, looking sternly at Alyosha and Kolya as he did so. Alyosha waved from the door to the coachman, and the carriage that had brought the doctor drove up. The captain darted out after the doctor, and, bowing apologetically, stopped him to get the last word. The poor fellow looked utterly crushed. There was a scared look in his eyes. "Your Excellency, is it possible?" he began, but could not go on, and clasped his hands in despair. Yet he still gazed imploringly at the doctor, as though a word from him might still change the poor boy's fate. "I can't help it, I am not God," the doctor answered offhand, though with the customary impressiveness. "Doctor, your Excellency, and will it be soon, soon?" "You must be prepared for anything," said the doctor in emphatic and incisive tones, and, dropping his eyes, he was about to step out to the coach. "Your Excellency, for Christ's sake!" The terror-stricken captain stopped him again. "Your Excellency, but can nothing, absolutely nothing, save him now?" "It's not in my hands now," said the doctor impatiently. "But, he stopped suddenly. "If you could, for instance... "Send your patient at once, without delay." The words "at once, without delay" the doctor uttered with an almost wrathful sternness that made the captain start. "To Syracuse. The change the new beneficial climatic conditions might possibly affect—" "To Syracuse!" cried the captain, unable to grasp what was said. "Syracuse is in Sicily," Kolya said suddenly in explanation. The doctor looked at him. "Sicily, your excellency," said the captain. "But you've seen," he spread out his hands, indicating his surroundings, "Mamma and my family." "No, Sicily is not the place for the family. The family should go to the Caucasus in the early spring. Your daughter must go to the Caucasus, and your wife, after a course of the waters in the Caucasus for her rheumatism, must be sent straight to Paris to the mental specialist Lepelletier. I could give you a note to him, and then there might be a change." "Doctor, doctor, but you see..." The captain flung wide his hands again despairingly, indicating the bare wooden walls of the passage. "Well, that's not my business," grinned the doctor. "I've only told you the answer of medical science to your question as to possible—" "Don't be afraid, apothecary, my dog won't bite you," Kolya rapped out loudly, noticing the doctor's rather uneasy glance at Perezvon, who was standing in the doorway. There was a wrathful note in Kolya's voice. He used the word apothecary instead of doctor on purpose and, as he explained afterwards, used it to insult him. "What's that?" The doctor flung up his head, staring with surprise at Kolya. "Who's this?" he addressed Alyosha, as though asking him to explain. "It's Perezvon's master, don't worry about me," Kolya said incisively again. "Perezvon?" Translator's note: a chime of bells. Repeated the doctor, perplexed. "He hears the bell, but where it is he cannot tell. Good-bye, we shall meet in Syracuse." "Who's this? Who is this?" The doctor flew into a terrible rage. "He's a schoolboy, doctor, he's a mischievous boy, take no notice of him," said Alyosha, frowning and speaking quickly. "Kolya, hold your tongue!" he cried to Krasotkin. "Take no notice of him, doctor," he repeated rather impatiently. "He wants a thrashing, a good thrashing." The doctor stamped in a perfect fury. "And you know, apothecary, my Perezvon might bite," said Kolya, turning pale, with quivering voice and flashing eyes. "You see, Perezvon..." "Kolya, if you say another word, I'll have nothing more to do with you," Alyosha cried peremptorily. "There's only one man in the world who can command Nikolay Krasotkin. This is the man." Kolya pointed to Alyosha. "I obey him. Good-bye." He stepped forward, opened the door, and quickly went into the inner room. Perezvon flew after him. The doctor stood still for 5 seconds in amazement, looking at Alyosha. Then, with a curse, he went out quickly to the carriage, repeating aloud, This is... I don't know what it is." The captain darted forward to help him into the carriage. Alyosha followed Kolya into the room. He was already by Ilusha's bedside. The sick boy was holding his hand and calling for his father. A minute later the captain, too, came back. "Father, father, come, we..." Ilusha faltered in violent excitement, but apparently unable to go on, he flung his wasted arms, found his father and Kolya, uniting them in one embrace and hugging them as tightly as he could. The captain suddenly began to shake with dumb sobs, and Kolya's lips and chin twitched. "Father, father, how sorry I am for you!" Ilusha moaned bitterly. "Ilusha, darling, the doctor said... you would be all right. We shall be happy. The doctor..." the captain began. "Ah, father, I know what the new doctor said to you about me. I saw..." cried Ilusha, and again he hugged them both with all his strength, hiding his face on his father's shoulder. "Father, don't cry, and when I die, get a good boy, another one. Choose one of them, a good one, call him Ilusha, and love him instead of me." "Hush, old man, you'll get well!" Krasotkin cried suddenly in a voice that sounded angry. "But don't ever forget me, father," Ilusha went on. "Come to my grave. And father, bury me by our big stone, where we used to go for our walk, and come to me there with Krasotkin in the evening. And Perezvon, I shall expect you. Father, father. His voice broke. They were all three silent, still embracing. Nina was crying quietly in her chair, and at last, seeing them all crying, Mamma, too, burst into tears. Ilusha, Ilusha, she exclaimed. Krasotkin suddenly released himself from Ilusha's embrace. Goodbye, old man. Mother expects me back to dinner, he said quickly. What a pity I did not tell her. She will be dreadfully anxious. But after dinner I'll come back to you, for the whole day, for the whole evening, and I'll tell you all sorts of things, and I'll bring Perezvon. But now I'll take him with me, because he will begin to howl when I'm away and bother you. Goodbye. And he ran out into the passage. He didn't want to cry, but in the passage he burst into tears. Alyosha found him crying. Kolya, you must be sure to keep your word and come, or you'll be terribly disappointed, Alyosha said emphatically. I will. Oh, how I curse myself for not having come before, muttered Kolya, crying and no longer ashamed of it. At that moment the captain flew out of the room and at once closed the door behind him. His face looked frenzied, his lips were trembling. He stood before the two and flung up his arms. I don't want a good boy. I don't want another boy, he muttered in a wild whisper, clenching his teeth. If I forget thee, Jerusalem, may my tongue... He broke off with a sob and sank on his knees before the wooden bench. Pressing his fists against his head, he began sobbing with absurd, whimpering cries, doing his utmost that his cries should not be heard in the room. Kolya ran out into the street. Goodbye, Karamazov. Will you come yourself? He cried sharply and angrily to Alyosha. I will certainly come in the evening. What was that he said about Jerusalem? What did he mean by that? It's from the Bible. If I forget thee, Jerusalem, that is, if I forget all that is most precious to me, if I let anything take its place, then may... I understand, that's enough. Mind you come. Ici, Perezvon, he cried with positive ferocity to the dog, and with rapid strides he went home. End of Book 10.
Book 11, Chapter 1 of the Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 11, Ivan. Chapter 1, at Grushenka's. Alyosha went towards the cathedral square to the widow Morozov's house to see Grushenka, who had sent Fenya to him early in the morning with an urgent message begging him to come. Questioning Fenya, Alyosha learned that her mistress had been particularly distressed since the previous day. During the 2 months that had passed since Mitya's arrest, Alyosha had called frequently at the widow Morozov's house, both from his own inclination and to take messages from Mitya. 3 days after Mitya's arrest, Grushenka was taken very ill, and was ill for nearly 5 weeks. For 1 whole week she was unconscious. She was very much changed, thinner and a little sallow, though she had for the past fortnight been well enough to go out. But to Alyosha her face was even more attractive than before, and he liked to meet her eyes when he went in to her. A look of firmness and intelligent purpose had developed in her face. There were signs of a spiritual transformation in her, and a steadfast, fine, and humble determination that nothing could shake could be discerned in her. There was a small vertical line between her brows, which gave her charming face a look of concentrated thought, almost austere at the first glance. There was scarcely a trace of her former frivolity. It seemed strange to Alyosha, too, that in spite of the calamity that had overtaken the poor girl, betrothed to a man who had been arrested for a terrible crime, almost at the instant of their betrothal, in spite of her illness and the most inevitable sentence hanging over Mitya, Grushenka had not yet lost her youthful cheerfulness. There was a soft light in the once proud eyes, though at times they gleamed with the old vindictive fire when she was visited by one disturbing thought stronger than ever in her heart. The object of that uneasiness was the same as ever, Katerina Ivanovna, of whom Grushenka had even raved when she lay in delirium. Alyosha knew that she was fearfully jealous of her, yet Katerina Ivanovna had not once visited Mitya in his prison, though she might have done it whenever she liked. All this made it a difficult problem for Alyosha, for he was the only person to whom Grushenka opened her heart, and from whom she was continually asking advice. Sometimes he was unable to say anything. Full of anxiety, he entered her lodging. She was at home. She had returned from seeing Mitya half an hour before, and from the rapid movement with which she leapt up from her chair to meet him, he saw that she had been expecting him with great impatience. A pack of cards dealt for a game of fools lay on the table. A bed had been made up. On the leather sofa, on the other side, and Maximov lay, half reclining, on it. He wore a dressing gown and a cotton nightcap, and was evidently ill and weak, though he was smiling blissfully. When the homeless old man returned with Grushenka from Mokroe 2 months before, he had simply stayed on and was still staying with her. He arrived with her in rain and sleet, sat down on the sofa, drenched and scared, and gazed mutely at her with a timid, appealing smile. Grushenka, who was in terrible grief and in the first stage of fever, almost forgot his existence in all she had to do the first half hour after her arrival. Suddenly she chanced to look at him intently. He laughed a pitiful, helpless little laugh. She called Fenya and told her to give him something to eat. All that day he sat in the same place, almost without stirring. When it got dark and the shutters were closed, Fenya asked her mistress, "Is the gentleman going to stay the night, mistress?" "Yes, make him a bed on the sofa," answered Grushenka. Questioning him in more detail, Grushenka learned from him that he had literally nowhere to go, and that "Mr. Kalganov, my benefactor, told me straight that he wouldn't receive me again, and gave me 5 rubles." "Well, God bless you, you'd better stay, then," Grushenka decided in her grief, smiling compassionately at him. Her smile wrung the old man's heart, and his lips twitched with grateful tears. And so the destitute wanderer had stayed with her ever since. He did not leave the house even when she was ill. Fenya and her grandmother, the cook, did not turn him out, but went on serving him meals and making up his bed on the sofa. Grushenka had grown used to him, and coming back from seeing Mitya, whom she had begun to visit in prison before she was really well, she would sit down and begin talking to Maximushka about trifling matters, to keep her from thinking of her sorrow. The old man turned out to be a good storyteller on occasions, so that at last he became necessary to her. Grushenka saw scarcely anyone else beside Alyosha, who did not come every day and never stayed long. Her old merchant lay seriously ill at this time, at his last gasp, as they said in the town, and he did, in fact, die a week after Mitya's trial. 3 weeks before his death, feeling the end approaching, he made his sons, their wives and children, come upstairs to him at last, and bade them not leave him again. From that moment he gave strict orders to his servants not to admit Grushenka, and to tell her if she came, "The master wishes you long life and happiness, and tells you to forget him." But Grushenka sent almost every day to inquire after him. "You've come at last!" she cried, flinging down the cards and joyfully greeting Alyosha. "And Maximushka's been scaring me that perhaps you wouldn't come. Ah, how I need you! Sit down to the table. What, will you have coffee?" "Yes, please," said Alyosha, sitting down at the table. "I am very hungry." "That's right. Fenya, coffee!" cried Grushenka. "It's been made a long time ready for you. And bring some little pies, and mind they are hot. Do you know, we've had a storm over those pies today. I took them to the prison for him, and, would you believe it, he threw them back to me, he would not eat them. He flung one of them on the floor and stamped on it. So I said to him, 'I shall leave them with the warder.' If you don't eat them before evening, it will be that your venomous spite is enough for you. With that I went away. We quarreled again, would you believe it? Whenever I go, we quarrel." Grushenka said all this in one breath in her agitation. Maximov, feeling nervous, at once smiled and looked on the floor. "What did you quarrel about this time?" asked Alyosha. "I didn't expect it in the least. Only fancy, he is jealous of the Pole." "Why are you keeping him?" he said. "So you've begun keeping him?" "He is jealous. Jealous of me all the time. Jealous, eating and sleeping. He even took into his head to be jealous of Kuzma last week." "But he knew about the Pole before." "Yes, there it is. He has known about him from the very beginning, but today he suddenly got up and began scolding about him. I am ashamed to repeat what he said. Silly fellow. Rakitin went in as I came out. Perhaps Rakitin is egging him on. What do you think?" she added carelessly. "He loves you. That's what it is. He loves you so much. And now he is particularly worried." "I should think he might be with the trial tomorrow. And I went to him to say something about tomorrow, for I dread to think what's going to happen then. You say that he is worried. But how worried I am! And he talks about the Pole. He's too silly. He is not jealous of Maximushka yet, anyway." "My wife was dreadfully jealous over me too," Maximov put in his word. "Jealous of you?" Grushenka laughed in spite of herself. "Of whom could she have been jealous?" "Of the servant girls." "Hold your tongue, Maximushka. I am in no laughing mood now. I feel angry. Don't ogle the pies. I shan't give you any. They are not good for you. And I won't give you any vodka either. I have to look after him, too, just as though I kept an almshouse," she laughed. "I don't deserve your kindness. I am a worthless creature," said Maximov, with tears in his voice. "You would do better to spend your kindness on people of more use than me." Everyone is of use, Maximushka. And how can we tell who's of most use? If only that Pole didn't exist, Alyosha. He's taken it into his head to fall ill, too, today. I've been to see him also. And I shall send him some pies, too, on purpose. I hadn't sent him any, but Mitya accused me of it, so now I shall send some. Ah, here's Fenya with a letter. Yes, it's from the Poles begging again." Pan Musylovich had indeed sent an extremely long and characteristically eloquent letter in which he begged her to lend him 3 rubles. In the letter was enclosed a receipt for the sum, with a promise to repay it within 3 months, signed by Pan Wróblewski as well. Grushenka had received many such letters, accompanied by such receipts, from her former lover during the fortnight of her convalescence. But she knew that the 2 Poles had been to ask after her health during her illness. The first letter Grushenka got from them was a long one, written on large note paper, and with a big family crest on the seal. It was so obscure and rhetorical that Grushenka put it down before she had read half, unable to make head or tail of it. She could not attend to letters then. The first letter was followed next day by another in which Pan Musylovich begged her for a loan of 2,000 rubles for a very short period. Grushenka left that letter too unanswered. A whole series of letters had followed, one every day, all as pompous and rhetorical, but the loan asked for, gradually diminishing, dropped to 100 rubles, then to 25, to 10, and finally Grushenka received a letter in which both the Poles begged her for only 1 ruble and included a receipt signed by both. Then Grushenka suddenly felt sorry for them, and at dusk she went round herself to their lodging. She found the 2 Poles in great poverty, almost destitution, without food or fuel, without cigarettes, in debt to their landlady. The 200 rubles they had carried off from Mitya at Mokroe had soon disappeared. But Grushenka was surprised at their meeting with her arrogant dignity and self-assertion, with the greatest punctilio and pompous speeches. Grushenka simply laughed, and gave her former admirer 10 rubles. Then, laughing, she told Mitya of it, and he was not in the least jealous. But ever since, the Poles had attached themselves to Grushenka and bombarded her daily with requests for money, and she had always sent them small sums. And now that day Mitya had taken it into his head to be fearfully jealous. Like a fool, I went round to him just for a minute on the way to see Mitya, for he is ill too, my Pole, Grushenka began again with nervous haste. I was laughing, telling Mitya about it. Fancy, I said, my Pole had the happy thought to sing his old songs to me to the guitar. He thought I would be touched and marry him. Mitya leapt up swearing. So, there, I'll send them the pies. Fenya, is it that little girl they've sent? Here, give her 3 rubles and pack up a dozen pies in a paper and tell her to take them. And you, Alyosha, be sure to tell Mitya that I did send them the pies. I wouldn't tell him for anything, said Alyosha, smiling. Ek, you think he is unhappy about it. Why, he's jealous on purpose. He doesn't care, said Grushenka bitterly. On purpose? Queried Alyosha. I tell you, you are silly, Alyosha. You know nothing about it, with all your cleverness. I am not offended that he is jealous of a girl like me. I would be offended if he were not jealous. I am like that. I am not offended at jealousy. I have a fierce heart too. I can be jealous myself. Only what offends me is that he doesn't love me at all. I tell you, he is jealous now on purpose. Am I blind? Don't I see? He began talking to me just now of that woman, of Katerina, saying she was this and that, and she had ordered a doctor from Moscow for him to try and save him, how she had ordered the best counsel, the most learned one too. So he loves her. If he'll praise her, to my face, more shame to him. He's treated me badly himself, so he attacked me to make out I am in fault first, and to throw it all on me. You were with your Pole before me, so I can't be blamed for Katerina. That's what it amounts to. He wants to throw the whole blame on me. He attacked me on purpose. On purpose, I tell you. But I'll... Grushenka could not finish saying what she would. She hid her eyes in her handkerchief and sobbed violently. He doesn't love Katerina Ivanovna, said Alyosha firmly. Well, whether he loves her or not, I'll soon find out for myself, said Grushenka, with a menacing note in her voice, taking the handkerchief from her eyes. Her face was distorted. Alyosha saw sorrowfully that from being mild and serene it had become sullen and spiteful. Enough of this foolishness, she said suddenly. It's not for that I sent you. Alyosha, darling, to-morrow. What will happen to-morrow? That's what worries me, and it's only me it worries. I look at everything, and no one is thinking of it. No one cares about it. Are you thinking about it then? To-morrow he'll be tried, you know. Tell me, how will he be tried? You know it's the valet. The valet killed him. Good heavens, can they condemn him in place of the valet, and will no one stand up for him? They haven't troubled the valet at all, have they? He's been severely cross-examined, observed Alyosha thoughtfully. But everyone came to the conclusion it was not he. Now he is lying very ill. He has been ill ever since the attack. Really ill, added Alyosha. Oh dear, couldn't you go to that counsel yourself, and tell him the whole thing by yourself? He's been brought from Petersburg, for 3,000 rubles, they say. We gave these 3,000 together, even Katerina Ivanovna and I, but she paid 2,000 for the doctor from Moscow herself. The counsel Fetyukovitch would have charged me more, but the case has become known all over Russia. It's talked of in the papers and journals. Fetyukovitch agreed to come more for the glory of the thing, because the case became so notorious. I saw him yesterday. Well, did you talk to him? Grushenka put in eagerly. He listened and said nothing. He told me that he had already formed his opinion, but he promised to give my words consideration. Consideration? Ah, they are swindlers. They'll ruin him. And why did she send for the doctor? As an expert. They want to prove that Mitya's mad and committed the murder when he didn't know what he was doing. Alyosha smiled gently. But Mitya won't agree to that. Yes, but that would be the truth, if he had killed him, cried Grushenka. He was mad then, perfectly mad, and that was my fault, wretch that I am. But, of course, he didn't do it. He didn't do it. And they are all against him, the whole town. Even Fenya's evidence went to prove he had done it. And the people at the shop, and that official, and at the tavern too, before, people had heard him say so. They are all against him, all crying out against him. Yes, there's a fearful accumulation of evidence, Alyosha observed grimly. And Grigory Vasilievich sticks to his story that the door was open, persists that he saw it. There's no shaking him. I went and talked to him myself. He's rude about it too. Yes, that's perhaps the strongest evidence against him, said Alyosha. And as for Mitya's being mad, he certainly seems like it now, Grushenka began with a peculiarly anxious and mysterious air. Do you know, Alyosha, I've been wanting to talk to you about it for a long time. I go to him every day and simply wonder about him. Tell me now, what do you suppose he's always talking about? He talks and talks, and I can make nothing of it. I fancied he was talking of something intellectual that I couldn't understand in my foolishness. Only he suddenly began talking to me about a babe, that is, about some child. Why is the babe poor, he said. It's for the babe I am going to Siberia now. I am not a murderer, but I must go to Siberia. What that meant, what babe, I couldn't tell for the life of me. Only I cried when he said it, because he said it so nicely. He cried himself, and I cried too. He suddenly kissed me and made the sign of the cross over me. What did it mean, Alyosha? Tell me. What is this babe? It must be Rakitin. Who's been going to see him lately? Smiled Alyosha. Though that's not Rakitin's doing. I didn't see Mitya yesterday. I'll see him today. No, it's not Rakitin. It's his brother, Ivan Fyodorovitch, upsetting him. It's his going to see him, that's what it is, Grushenka began, and suddenly broke off. Alyosha gazed at her in amazement. Ivan's going? Has he been to see him? Mitya told me himself that Ivan hasn't been once. There, what a girl I am, blurting things out, exclaimed Grushenka, confused and suddenly blushing. Stay, Alyosha, hush. Since I've said so much, I'll tell the whole truth. He's been to see him twice. The first directly he arrived. He galloped here from Moscow at once, of course before I was taken ill, and the second time was a week ago. He told Mitya not to tell you about it under any circumstances, and not to tell anyone, in fact. He came secretly. Alyosha sat plunged in thought, considering something. The news evidently impressed him. Ivan doesn't talk to me of Mitya's case, he said slowly. He's said very little to me these last 2 months. And whenever I go to see him, he seems vexed at my coming, so I've not been to him for the last 3 weeks. If he was there a week ago, there certainly has been a change in Mitya this week. There has been a change, Grushenka assented quickly. They have a secret. Mitya told me herself there was a secret, and such a secret that Mitya can't rest. Before then, he was cheerful, and indeed he is cheerful now, but when he shakes his head like that, you know, and strides about the room and keeps pulling at the hair on his right temple with his right hand, I know there is something on his mind worrying him. I know. He was cheerful before, though indeed he is cheerful today. But you said he was worried. Yes, he is worried and yet cheerful. He keeps going on being irritable for a minute, and then cheerful, and then irritable again. And you know, Alyosha, I am constantly wondering at him. With this awful thing hanging over him, he sometimes laughs at such trifles as though he were a baby himself. And did he really tell you not to tell me about Ivan? Did he say, "Don't tell him"? Yes, he told me don't tell him. It's you that Mitya is most afraid of. Because it's a secret, he said himself it was a secret. Alyosha, darling, go to him, and find out what the secret is, and come and tell me," Grushenka besought him with sudden eagerness. "Set my mind at rest, that I may know the worst that's in store for me. That's why I sent for you." "You think it's something to do with you? If it were, he wouldn't have told you there was a secret." "I don't know. Perhaps he wants to tell me, but doesn't dare to. He warns me. There's a secret, he tells me, but he won't tell me what it is." "What do you think yourself?" "What do I think? It's the end for me, that's what I think. They all three have been plotting my end. For Katerina's in it. It's all Katerina. It all comes from her. She is this and that means that I am not. He tells me that beforehand, warns me. He is planning to throw me over. That's the whole secret. They've planned it together, the three of them. Mitya, Katerina, and even Fyodorovitch. Alyosha, I've been wanting to ask you a long time. A week ago he suddenly told me that Ivan was in love with Katerina, because he often goes to see her. Did he tell me the truth, or not? Tell me, on your conscience, tell me the worst." "I won't tell you a lie. Ivan is not in love with Katerina Ivanovna, I think." "Oh, that is what I thought. He is lying to me, shameless deceiver, that's what it is. And he was jealous of me just now, so as to put the blame on me afterwards. He is stupid, he can't disguise what he is doing. He is so open, you know. But I'll give it to him. I'll give it to him. 'You believe I did it,' he said. He said that to me. To me. He reproached me with that. God forgive him. You wait, I'll make it hot for Katerina at the trial. I'll just say a word then. I'll tell everything then." And again she cried bitterly. "This I can tell you for certain, Grushenka," Alyosha said, getting up. "First, that he loves you more than anyone in the world, and you only, believe me. I know. I do know. The second thing is, I don't want to worm his secret out of him, but if he'll tell me of himself today, I shall tell him straight out that I have promised to tell you. Then I'll come to you today and tell you. Only, I fancy, Katerina Ivanovna has nothing to do with it, and that the secret is about something else. That's certain. It isn't likely it's about Katerina Ivanovna, it seems to me. Goodbye for now." Alyosha shook hands with her. Grushenka was still crying. He saw that she put little faith in his consolation, but she was better for having had her sorrow out, for having spoken of it. He was sorry to leave her in such a state of mind, but he was in haste. He had a great many things to do still. End of Chapter 1 of Book 11. Recording by Katie Riley. May 2009.